But the bottom line is that when a signal hits a typical individual, the sympathetic areas needed for the resolution of the social problem are activated straight away. In autism, you see there's a very local activation that makes that noise and the signal can be very much blurred together, and it takes a long time before you get an adequate response. So oftentimes, what you see in autism is that it's not that they do not know, it's not that they do not feel, it's not that they do not experience it, but the time they need to fit that all together is so much longer that in the normal process of communication, they are desynchronized. So, when you look at these individual diagnoses, we should consider then a diagnosis which is going to give us information not only on the behavioral phenotype, but also on the neurocognitive strengths and weaknesses, and hopefully in the near future also in the functional pathways of the brain. So I hope that over the coming years our process of classification and diagnostic is going to be shifting from the classification just on criteria to a diagnosis with strengths, weaknesses, and information processing style. And when you then think, what are you going to do? What you're going to do in education is you're going to develop a system of psychoeducation, so you're going to give a lot of information about what are the strengths and the weaknesses of this person, try to explain to the person itself that it has these different strengths and weaknesses, and that the whole goal of the education is going to be to kind of make a prosthesis, say glasses, for them to enable them to have an optimal adaptation to life. And when you think of the structures where that education should be put in place, you first think of the home situation. So when you start with early interventions, it's helping parents to cope with a child that's not mad, but it's a child that's different. And you have to take into account those differences, but know what those differences are to get an interaction that's going to be profitable both for the parents that'll feel much less powerless, and for the child that is going to be helped to get in touch with the environment. And there are different programs, early intervention programs that you can hear about during this Congress that enable this process of education where the parents are helped to change their systems. Daycare, school, there we of course, based on the TEACH method that was developed in North Carolina, structure in time, space, scheduling, in activities. And one of the important things is that you see that the beauty of TEACH is that oftentimes the activity times at school or in daycare centers are quite well. But what is taken account and not taken into account as it should be are the changes, leisure time, and respite care. That's one of the big pitfalls. We always think that people with autism like breaks, like changes. They don't like them often. And we have to pay a lot of attention to that. So spend a lot of time thinking about what it takes a child or an individual with autism to get from home to their school, their working place, all the things that happen, and try to accommodate to that. Think about living and housing, think about adaptations in work and daycare, and think also, of course, of behavioral and developmental themes. Not aggression in autism can be a reflection of anxiety far more than aggression just generally. So instead of saying, well, we have to suppress that aggression, think, make functional analysis to understand why this person, under these circumstances, shows aggressive behavior. And oftentimes it's more about changing the schemes changing the way things are organized that's going to solve the problem than putting in drugs or all kinds of behavioral measures to try and make them less aggressive. We have to make sure they feel more comfortable and are less anxious. This éducation permanente means that we have to involve parents and caregivers. It's not professionals giving education to parents and caregivers. No, it's a reciprocal process. You know, as a professional, I learn far more from parents than they do from me. But the only thing we can do is we can help them put things in perspective to enable them to help their children in a good fashion. One of the big pitfalls is that we often tend to forget the children, the brothers and sisters in the family. It's always awful to be confronted in your practice to someone who makes an appointment, someone in his early adult life, and then you think, well, that name rings a bell, and then you realize you've been working with their brother and their parents for a long time, and you've forgotten what an impact having a brother like that had on the rest of the siblings. Involve the grandparents, because grandparents love their grandchildren, but oftentimes are quite harsh on their children. You know, they are inclined to think that it's going to be okay, and don't worry, and you really have to involve the grandparents to make them supportive to their children instead of telling their children that there's not much at hand. Involve professionals. One of the big pitfalls, you know, October is always a very busy month because every year it happens in the same way. Before the summer break, you've reached quite a good schedule with the school, and then they get a new teacher. And then you say, well, should we have a little meeting in August to prepare the new year? And then the teacher says, yeah, no, I know many children with autism, so I'm going to be able to cope. And I say, well, you don't know this child? No, no worries. And then in October there's a phone call. Well, this is quite difficult. It's quite different from what I've experienced before, and then you start. So it's not something that frustrates me, but it's something you just have to take into account. Many people at first hand think, because I know one person with autism spectrum disorder, I know how to cope with all of them, and there's nothing less true. The last message is one that I gave you already. Involve the people with autism spectrum disorders. You know, they are the ones that are going to tell us why they get anxious, what bugs them. And Peter Vermeulen, who will be speaking to you later in this session, has developed some wonderful programs that help you to communicate with people with autism, not blaming them for being as they are, but acknowledging that they're special, that they're different, and that sometimes they're the ones that can say what bugs them and where they have their difficulties. So what are our future directions? When we look at DSM-5, one of the obvious changes is that DSM-5 is going to take into account more a lumping and is going to go away from the splitting. There will be no differences between autism, autistic disorder, Asperger disorder, PDD-NOS. It's just going to be autism spectrum disorder. And the social interaction part and the communication part are going to be merged. So it's going to be a far more simple scheme for the classification. It's a benefit because then we don't have these discussions about is it this or is it that, but it's a pitfall too in the sense that we'll have to we have to acknowledge the differences, the huge differences between individuals within that spectrum. Another change that is very interesting is that the World Wide Web is giving us many opportunities to communicate, to give distance learning to people with autism, but also, of course, and that was told yesterday in a symposium on girls from the UK, that the web is also somewhere where you can be very vulnerable. So we have to protect our individuals with autism altogether. The individual profile will remain the cornerstone of guidance, support, treatment, and the education that we can give to ensure well-being for people with autism now and in the near future. Thank you very much for your kind attention.